Welcome to my YouTube channel, Shadow Whispers Another Story. When road trips turn deadly, true horror stories on the highway. Part 1. The beginning of the journey. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty highway as Emily adjusted her rearview mirror. The road stretched endlessly before her, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the dense forest that seemed to close in on either side. She had been driving for hours, her only companions the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. It was supposed to be a simple road trip, a chance to clear her head after a rough few months. But as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had chosen this route on a whim, eager to avoid the monotony of the interstate. The GPS had assured her it was a shortcut, but the further she drove, the more she began to doubt its accuracy. The road was narrower than she had expected, the trees thicker, the darkness more oppressive. And then there were the signs, old, rusted, and barely legible, that seemed to appear out of nowhere, warning of dangers she couldn't quite decipher. Detour ahead. One read, though the road ahead looked clear. "No turning back," another proclaimed, its letters faded but still menacing. Emily tried to shake off the unease, telling herself it was just her imagination. But as the miles stretched on, the feeling only grew stronger. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees leaning closer, their branches clawing at the edges of the road. The headlights of her car cut through the darkness, but the light felt feeble, as if the night itself was resisting it. And then, just as she was beginning to consider turning back, she saw it. A figure standing on the side of the road. At first, she thought it was a hitchhiker, but as she drew closer, she realized it was something else entirely. The figure was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs elongated, its face obscured by the shadows. It didn't move, didn't react to her approach, but Emily could feel its eyes on her, watching, waiting. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sped past, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure chasing after her, but the road behind her was empty. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, to believe it had just been a trick of the light. But then the radio crackled to life, the static giving way to a voice that was low and guttural, speaking words she couldn't understand. Emily reached to turn it off, but the dial wouldn't budge. The voice grew louder, more insistent, until it was all she could hear, filling the car, filling her head. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily's hands were trembling now, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She wanted to stop, to pull over and collect herself, but something told her to keep going, to get as far away from this place as possible. And so she drove, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. What had she seen? What had she heard? And why did she feel like she was being watched? The road seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Emily's thoughts were a jumble of fear and confusion, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, to find another way. But the GPS insisted she was on the right path, its cheerful voice a stark contrast to the dread that was settling in her chest. And then, just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, she saw the lights. They were faint at first, little more than pinpricks in the distance. But as she drew closer, they grew brighter, more distinct. It was a gas station, its neon sign flickering weakly in the night. Emily felt a surge of relief at the sight of it, a beacon of civilization in the midst of this endless wilderness. She pulled into the parking lot, her tires crunching on the gravel, and turned off the engine. For a moment, she just sat there, her hands still gripping the wheel, her heart still racing. But then she took a deep breath, forced herself to calm down, and stepped out of the car. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and there was a stillness to it that made her skin crawl. The gas station was small, its windows dark, its pumps old and rusted. There was no sign of life, no movement, no sound. Emily hesitated, her instincts once again telling her to get back in the car and drive away. But she needed gas and she needed answers. And so she walked towards the building, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The inside of the gas station was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. The shelves were lined with outdated products, their labels faded and peeling. The counter was empty, the cash register old and covered in a layer of grime. Emily called out, her voice trembling, but there was no response. She was about to leave, to get back in her car and drive away, when she saw it. A figure standing in the shadows at the back of the store. It was the same figure she had seen on the road, tall and thin, its face still obscured. But this time, it moved, stepping into the light, and Emily felt her blood run cold. Its face was a mask of horror, its eyes hollow, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. And then it spoke, its voice a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down her spine. "You shouldn't have come here." Part 2, the gas station. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. The dim light of the gas station flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. She wanted to run, to scream, but her body refused to obey. It was as if the figure had some kind of hold over her, its presence paralyzing her with fear. Who are you?" she managed to stammer, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes boring into hers. "You don't need to know who I am," it rasped. "You just need to know that you're not supposed to be here." Emily's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this some kind of prank? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion? But the fear she felt was all too real, and the figure standing before her was no illusion. I just needed gas," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to." "You took the wrong road," the figure interrupted, its voice growing louder, more menacing. "And now you're trapped." Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the words sank in. Trapped? What did that mean? She glanced towards the door, calculating the distance, wondering if she could make a run for it. But the figure seemed to read her thoughts, its grotesque smile widening. "Go ahead," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "Try to leave, but you'll only end up back here." Emily's legs felt like lead as she took a step towards the door, her eyes never leaving the figure. It didn't move, didn't try to stop her, but she could feel its gaze following her, weighing her down. She reached the door, her hand trembling as she pushed it open and stepped outside. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but it was a welcome relief after the stifling atmosphere of the gas station. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, and looked around. The parking lot was empty, her car the only vehicle in sight. The forest loomed in the distance, its trees dark and foreboding. She hurried to her car, fumbling with the keys, and climbed inside. The engine roared to life, and Emily wasted no time in pulling out of the parking lot. She glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching her go. But the gas station was dark and silent, its neon sign flickering weakly in the night. She drove faster, the road stretching out before her, the trees a blur on either side. The GPS on her dashboard insisted she was on the right path, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The road seemed familiar, too familiar, and as she rounded a bend, her heart sank. There, in the distance, was the gas station. Emily's hands tightened on the wheel as she stared at the flickering neon sign, her mind reeling. How was this possible? She had driven for miles, hadn't she? She should have been far away by now. But there it was, the same gas station, the same empty parking lot. She slowed down, her mind racing. Maybe she had taken a wrong turn. Maybe she had gotten turned around in the dark. She pulled into the parking lot once again, her heart pounding in her chest. The gas station was just as she had left it, the door still ajar, the lights still flickering. Emily sat in her car, staring at the building, trying to make sense of what was happening. She couldn't stay here, but she couldn't keep driving in circles either. She needed to find another way out, another road, anything. But the forest was dense, the road narrow, and the night was growing darker by the minute. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves, and stepped out of the car. The air was still cold, the silence still oppressive. She walked towards the gas station, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the sound sending a shiver down her spine. The inside of the gas station was just as she had left it, the shelves still lined with outdated products, the counter still empty. But this time, there was no figure waiting for her. The store was empty, silent, and still. Emily hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to leave, to get back in her car and drive away. But she needed answers, and she needed to find a way out of this nightmare. She walked towards the counter, her eyes scanning the shelves, looking for anything that might help her. And then she saw it. A map, old and faded, lying on the counter. She picked it up, her hands trembling, and unfolded it. The map was of the area, but it was unlike any map she had ever seen. The roads were twisted, the names of the towns unfamiliar. And there, in the center of the map, was the gas station, marked with a symbol that sent a chill down her spine. It was a symbol she had seen before, in her nightmares, in the shadows of her mind. It was a symbol of something ancient, something evil. And as she stared at it, she realized the truth. She wasn't just lost. She was in a place that shouldn't exist, a place that defied logic and reason, a place where the rules of the world no longer applied. And she wasn't alone. Part 3, the forest. Emily's hands trembled as she stared at the map, the symbol burning into her mind. She had to get out of here, but the map offered no clear path. The roads twisted and turned, leading in circles, leading nowhere. She folded the map and stuffed it into her pocket, her mind racing. She couldn't stay here, but she couldn't keep driving in circles either. There had to be another way. She stepped out of the gas station, the cold night air biting at her skin. The forest loomed in the distance, its trees dark and foreboding. She had avoided it before, but now it seemed like her only option. If she could find a way through the forest, maybe she could reach the other side, find another road, another town. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, and walked towards the edge of the parking lot. The trees were dense, their branches twisted and gnarled, their leaves rustling in the wind. The ground was covered in a thick layer of leaves, the air thick with the smell of decay. Emily hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but she knew she had no choice. She stepped into the forest, the darkness closing in around her. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground was uneven, the roots of the trees twisting and turning, making it difficult to walk. The air was thick and heavy, the silence oppressive. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she pushed forward, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The forest seemed alive, the trees whispering secrets she couldn't understand. The further she went, the more she felt like she was being watched, like something was following her, just out of sight. She tried to keep her bearings, to remember the direction she had come from, but the forest was a maze, the trees all looking the same. She pulled out the map, hoping it would offer some guidance, but the symbols were unfamiliar, the paths unclear. She folded it and put it back in her pocket, her mind racing. And then she heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. It was a voice, low and guttural, speaking words she couldn't understand. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice grew louder, more insistent, until it was all she could hear, filling her head, filling the forest. She turned, her eyes scanning the darkness, but there was nothing there. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the trees, bouncing off the leaves. Emily's hands trembled as she reached for her phone, hoping to call for help, but there was no signal. She was alone, completely and utterly alone. The voice grew louder, more menacing, and Emily felt a surge of panic. She had to get out of here, had to find a way out of this nightmare. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the forest floor, the branches clawing at her skin. The voice followed her, growing louder, more insistent, until it was all she could hear. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Emily stumbled to a halt, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The forest was silent once again, the trees still and unmoving. She looked around, trying to get her bearings, but the trees all looked the same. She was lost, completely and utterly lost. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves, and forced herself to keep moving. She had to find a way out, had to keep going. The forest seemed endless, the darkness unrelenting, but she couldn't give up. She had to keep going, had to find a way out. And then she saw it. A light, faint but unmistakable, in the distance. It was a flicker, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. Emily's heart leapt in her chest as she hurried towards it, her feet stumbling over the roots of the trees. The light grew brighter, more distinct, until she could see its source. A cabin, nestled in the heart of the forest. Emily felt a surge of relief as she approached the cabin, her heart pounding in her chest. It was small, its windows dark, its door slightly ajar. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to be cautious, but she was desperate. She needed shelter, needed to rest, needed to find a way out of this nightmare. She pushed the door open, the wood creaking on its hinges. The inside of the cabin was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. The furniture was old and worn, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper. There was no sign of life, no movement, no sound. Emily stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. There was a fireplace, its ashes cold and lifeless, a table covered in dust, a chair overturned on the floor. She walked towards the fireplace, her footsteps echoing in the silence, and knelt down to inspect the ashes. And then she heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. It was a whisper, low and guttural, coming from the shadows. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it was all she could hear, filling the cabin, filling her head. She turned, her eyes scanning the darkness, but there was nothing there. The whisper seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the cabin, bouncing off the walls. Emily's hands trembled as she reached for the chair, hoping to use it as a weapon, but it was too heavy, too unwieldy. The whisper grew louder, more menacing, and Emily felt a surge of panic. She had to get out of here, had to find a way out of this nightmare. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the wooden floor, the door slamming shut behind her. The cabin was silent once again, the whisper gone, but Emily knew she wasn't alone. Something was in there with her, something ancient, something evil, and it wasn't going to let her leave. Part 4, the cabin. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she stood in the center of the cabin, her eyes darting around the room. The whisper had stopped, but the silence was almost worse. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, filled with the weight of something unseen, something waiting. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, and forced herself to think. She couldn't stay here, but she couldn't go back into the forest either. She needed to find a way out, needed to find a way to break free from this nightmare. Her eyes fell on the fireplace, the cold ashes a stark reminder of the cabin's abandonment. But then she noticed something, a faint glimmer of light coming from behind the fireplace. She knelt down, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the stones. They were loose, shifting under her fingers, and with a little effort, she was able to push them aside. Behind the stones was a small, hidden compartment, just large enough for a person to crawl through. Emily hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to be cautious, but she knew she had no choice. She had to see where it led. She crawled into the compartment, the space tight and claustrophobic. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, the walls rough and uneven. She pushed forward, her hands scraping against the stone, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, the darkness pressing in from all sides. But then, just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, she saw a light, a faint, flickering light, coming from up ahead. She hurried towards it, her heart pounding in her chest, and emerged into a small, hidden room. The room was dimly lit, the walls covered in strange symbols and markings. In the center of the room was a table, covered in candles. their flames flickering weakly in the darkness. And on the table was a book, its cover old and worn, its pages filled with strange, incomprehensible text. Emily's hands trembled as she reached out to touch the book, her fingers brushing against the cover. It was cold, unnaturally cold, and as she opened it, she felt a surge of dread. The pages were filled with symbols, similar to the ones on the map, similar to the ones she had seen in her nightmares. And then she heard it. A voice, low and guttural, speaking words she couldn't understand. It was the same voice she had heard in the forest, the same voice that had filled her head with fear. Emily's hands trembled as she closed the book, her mind racing. She had to get out of here, had to find a way to destroy the book, to break the curse, to escape this nightmare. But as she turned to leave, she saw it. A figure, standing in the shadows, its hollow eyes watching her, its grotesque smile twisting into a sneer. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped, its voice dripping with malice. "But now that you're here, you'll never leave." Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. She backed away, her hands trembling, her mind racing. She had to find a way out, had to find a way to fight back. And then she remembered the candles. She grabbed one, its flame flickering weakly in the darkness, and held it out in front of her. The figure hesitated, its hollow eyes narrowing, and Emily felt a surge of hope. She threw the candle at the figure, the flame catching on its tattered clothes. The figure let out a guttural scream, its body writhing in agony as the flames consumed it. Emily didn't wait to see what happened next. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the stone floor, the tunnel stretching out before her. She emerged into the cabin, the air thick with the smell of smoke. The figure was gone, but the flames were spreading, consuming the cabin, consuming the forest. Emily didn't stop to look back. She ran, her feet pounding against the forest floor, the trees a blur on either side. The flames were close behind her, the heat intense, the smoke thick and choking. But Emily didn't stop. She ran, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She had to get out of here, had to find a way to escape. And then she saw it. A road, narrow and overgrown, but a road nonetheless. She ran towards it, her feet stumbling over the roots of the trees, the flames close behind her. She reached the road, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps, and turned to look back. The forest was engulfed in flames, the trees burning, the smoke rising into the night sky. But the road was clear, the flames unable to reach it. Emily felt a surge of relief as she turned and ran down the road, her feet pounding against the asphalt. She didn't know where the road led, but she didn't care. She just had to get away, had to escape the nightmare that had consumed her. The road stretched out before her, the darkness pressing in from all sides, but Emily kept running, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, she saw it. A light, faint but unmistakable, in the distance. It was a town, its lights flickering weakly in the night. Emily felt a surge of hope as she hurried towards it, her feet stumbling over the asphalt. She reached the town, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps, and collapsed on the side of the road. The town was small, its streets empty, its buildings dark and silent. But it was a town, a place of safety, a place of refuge. Emily lay on the side of the road, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She had escaped the nightmare, but she knew it wasn't over. The forest was still burning, the flames consuming everything in their path. And the figure, the thing that had haunted her, was still out there, waiting, watching. But for now, she was safe. For now, she could rest. And as she closed her eyes, she knew that the nightmare was far from over. Part 5, The Town. Emily woke to the sound of sirens, their wails piercing the stillness of the night. She sat up, her body aching, her mind still foggy from exhaustion. The town was no longer silent. People were emerging from their homes, their faces filled with fear and confusion. The sky was lit with an eerie orange glow, the flames from the forest casting long shadows over the town. She stood up, her legs trembling, and looked towards the forest. The flames were still burning, their intensity undiminished, the smoke rising into the night sky. The townspeople were gathering in the streets, their voices filled with panic as they tried to make sense of what was happening. Emily felt a surge of guilt as she watched them. She had caused this, hadn't she? She had started the fire, had unleashed the nightmare on this unsuspecting town. But what choice did she have? She had to escape, had to survive. She walked towards the town, her feet dragging against the asphalt, her mind racing. She needed to find help, needed to find a way to stop the flames, to stop the nightmare. But as she approached the townspeople, she realized that they were already taking action. Fire trucks were arriving, their lights flashing, their sirens blaring. The townspeople were working together, forming bucket brigades, trying to contain the flames. Emily felt a surge of hope as she watched them, their determination unwavering in the face of the disaster. But then she saw it, a figure, standing on the edge of the town, its hollow eyes watching the flames, its grotesque smile twisting into a sneer. It was the same figure she had seen in the forest, the same figure that had haunted her. And it was here in the town, watching, waiting. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her mind racing. She had to warn the townspeople, had to tell them about the figure, about the nightmare. But how could she explain something she didn't even understand herself? She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the asphalt, her mind racing. She had to find a way to stop the figure, to stop the nightmare. But how? The book was gone, consumed by the flames. The map was useless, the symbols incomprehensible. She had nothing, no way to fight back. And then she remembered the candles. The flames had hurt the figure, had driven it back. Maybe fire was the key, the only way to stop it. She ran towards the fire trucks, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She reached the fire trucks, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps, and grabbed a fire extinguisher. She turned and ran towards the figure, her hands trembling, her mind racing. The figure turned to face her, its hollow eyes narrowing, its grotesque smile twisting into a sneer. "You can't stop me," it rasped, its voice dripping with malice. "You're just a pawn in my game." Emily didn't respond. She aimed the fire extinguisher at the figure and pulled the trigger, the foam spraying out in a thick, white cloud. The figure let out a guttural scream, its body writhing in agony as the foam consumed it. Emily didn't stop. She kept spraying, her hands trembling, her mind racing. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The foam settled on the ground, the air thick with the smell of chemicals. Emily stood there, her hands trembling, her mind racing. Was it over? Had she stopped it? She turned and looked towards the forest. The flames were still burning, their intensity undiminished, the smoke rising into the night sky. But the figure was gone, the nightmare was over. She had stopped it, had broken the curse. But at what cost? The forest was still burning, the town was still in danger. And the nightmare, the thing that had haunted her, was still out there, waiting, watching. Emily felt a surge of exhaustion as she collapsed on the side of the road, her body aching, her mind racing. She had escaped the nightmare, but she knew it wasn't over. The forest was still burning, the flames consuming everything in their path. And the figure, the thing that had haunted her, was still out there, waiting, watching. But for now, she was safe. For now, she could rest. And as she closed her eyes, she knew that the nightmare was far from over. The aftermath. The sun rose over the town, its light weak and pale, the sky still thick with smoke. The flames had finally been contained, the forest reduced to ashes, the town spared from destruction. But the damage had been done, the scars of the nightmare still fresh in the minds of the townspeople. Emily sat on the side of the road, her body aching, her mind racing. She had survived the nightmare, but at what cost? The forest was gone, the town was scarred, and the figure, the thing that had haunted her, was still out there, waiting, watching. She knew she couldn't stay here, couldn't risk bringing the nightmare back to the town. She had to leave, had to find a way to move on, to forget. But she knew that would be impossible. The nightmare would always be with her, a shadow in the back of her mind, a reminder of what she had faced. She stood up, her legs trembling, and walked towards her car. The townspeople were still gathered in the streets, their faces filled with fear and confusion. They didn't know what had happened, didn't know the truth, and Emily knew she couldn't tell them. They wouldn't believe her, wouldn't understand. She climbed into her car, her hands trembling as she turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and she pulled out of the town, the road stretching out before her. She didn't know where she was going, didn't know what she would do, but she knew she had to keep moving, had to keep running. The nightmare was over, but the scars would remain. And as she drove down the road, the sun rising behind her, she knew that she would never be the same again. What would you do if you found yourself in a situation like Emily's? Have you ever experienced something unexplainable on a road trip? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more chilling tales of horror on the highway. Stay safe out there, and remember, sometimes the road less traveled can lead to the darkest places. See you in next story. Thank you for watching.